Today I've had the great pleasure and privilege and a lot of fun talking to the phenomenal British jazz musician Pete Long about his new creation, or rather recreation, of Tchaikovsky's ballet Swan Lake for jazz orchestra, which was to be premiered and will be premiered in due course by the Ronnie Scott's Jazz Orchestra here in Deal. This is a Deal Music and Arts commission funded by Arts Council England, to whom we're always truly grateful. I'm sure you'll find Pete's discussion fascinating, and I had a lot of fun doing it. Well, Pete, it's lovely to have you with me, not in my home, but in yours. And
I'm very jealous of that Japanese screen, actually. Looks nice.
Well, we're all seeing how each other lives, aren't we, at this precise moment? It's a curious moment in time. But your home will have been a hive of creativity in the past couple of months, won't it? And what have you been creating?
Well, I like making FX models. So I've got a Hawker Hunter here that's nearly done, number 56 Squadron. That's all looking rather nice, isn't it? There's that. And I thought I'd go for something a little bit different. And I have a Dassault Ouragan from the Suez Crisis, a French jet in Israeli colours. That's rather cute, isn't it?
I see.
Yes. And mainly that, a bit of music.
Yes. Okay. And obviously you're going to be sorting out curtains as well, curtain rods in the not too future.
Little bit of destroy it yourself with the curtains, which obligingly fell down seconds before this pinnacle of showbiz glossiness the world is now tuning into.
Exactly. So, but musically, I mean, how are you finding? Yeah. How are you finding being confined from a musical perspective?
Oh, it's bliss. As long as no one gets ill. I haven't got people on the phone. I haven't got people emailing. I go for a lovely walk every day. I can practice my piano. I've always wanted to learn how to play the piano. I can practice my woodwind instruments. I'm doing a bit of home recording, more of which later. And I was thinking about taking a sabbatical anyway, so I've sort of had one foisted upon me. I mean, not that we should sort of say a global plague's a good thing, but the question was, how am I dealing with it? And I'm having a smashing quiet time.
But I would agree, because for a composer, this is an unusually productive time, because you can have the space, that freedom of time, where, as you say, you're not being interrupted by phone calls and emails and all this, that, and the other, which allow you that opportunity to just immerse yourself in your creative world. And what has your creative world been?
Well, aside from the Airfix, I've had a commission, you see, from the Deal Festival, which is a follow-on from a thing I did a couple of years ago, where I took The Planets by Gustav Holst and I orchestrated them in the style of Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington from the late 1960s. In the way that they actually did with the Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky and Peer Gynt by Grieg. There is a precedent for Ellington playing classical music, because I thought it'd be fun. And we played it at the Deal Festival, and it was such a success that I was asked if I had anything else to do by the good people of the festival. And so cheekily I suggested, well, why don't you ask me to do Swan Lake, which then you did. And so I had the time to do it. So, I was going to have to do it anyway, but instead of taking 3 weeks off work to do it, 3 weeks off work happened on its own. And so here it is.
But from a perspective of creating something like this, when you are doing, I mean, we might call, when you are trying to create something in the style of another person, that's not an easy thing to do. It's the understanding that you have to have of that person's work, of what they were trying to express, the whole history about them, and the time in which they were living, has to be not superficially ingrained. It has to be completely ingrained in you. And you do it so successfully.
Well, that's because I've listened to, I'd say 60% of the music I listen to is by Duke Ellington.
Now, what is it that attracted you to Duke Ellington?
It's very colourful, it's very rhythmic, it's very melodic, it's very exciting, it's harmonically extremely interesting. So those are the main points that get me. And since I discovered Ellington when I was about 15, I've listened to little else.
So you have been steeped in jazz and steeped in Duke Ellington from 15 or from before? When did you want to be a musician? When did that?
When I was on my 13th birthday, I went to see Star Wars, and I loved the music so much. I thought I wanted to play music. It was John Williams' music that got me into playing music in a way, and so yes, I went to see Star Wars for my 13th birthday treat, and it was a combination of that and discovering my mother's Glenn Miller record. Got me into wanting to play the saxophone, and so the whole thing grew from there. So only a couple of years later, I started listening to Duke Ellington. Now, the amazing thing about Duke Ellington is that it just doesn't stop going. Alan Barnes told me that for every week of his career, now Ellington's career went from 1920 to 1974. It's a long career. There's 5 minutes of recorded composition for every week. So you can imagine the amount of Ellington. I mean, there's whole acres of it I know nothing about still. It's this huge thing to discover. On Jazz Lockdown, the quiz show we've been doing online, Alan Shipton asked me Ellington questions, and I probably know 3 out of 5 of them because the subject matter is so huge. It's huge.
But when you actually start creating music as well in the style of Duke Ellington, it obviously goes further because you've not only got to look at the actual compositional style and the way in which he will orchestrate, the way in which he will actually balance his chords in each section, because he's quite specific about that, isn't he?
Yes, he's very specific. No, it's very interesting that. I mean, it's why Ellington's band's so interesting, because it's a good story about people, Duke Ellington's band. He was the first amongst equals, but the interesting thing about, one of the many interesting things about Ellington's writing is it was a symbiosis between him and his musicians. He would find out what they were good at, and he would actually edit things that they would play in warm-ups and so forth, and he would turn them into Ellington music, which they would then play. It's a unique setup to have a composer and a bunch of musicians working that closely for that long. Part of it was the accident of when it was, because it was commercially possible for that to happen. It isn't commercially possible for that to happen anymore. So it becomes very interesting, very stylized. And Ellington himself was a fascinating man. And so one of the things you have to do if you're going to write something that sounds like Duke Ellington is bear in mind that Ellington always left things to the last minute. It was part of he said he thrived on deadlines. So he would get a commission and he'd probably start on it the weekend before. And it would be written in an incredibly short time, because Ellington was a genius. He could get away with it. It's not a great compositional piece of advice unless you're as clever as him. But it's if you're only as clever as me and you're trying to do a pastiche of it, you've got to remember that Ellington wouldn't really fully develop many things because he just didn't spend the time on it. And Ellington's score is fascinating because they're written in school exercise books in short score. He put the whole band onto 4 staves, and no rhythm section parts at all, nothing indicated, because that was all in his head because he was the piano player. So there'd be a line for the saxes, then weirdly a line for Harry Carney, the baritone sax player. He'd get his own line. I think I don't know why that is, but he just did. Then the trumpets and trombones. So it'd be a maximum of 4 staves, but often it would just be 1 stave if it was 3 instruments playing. So Ellington never had that thing which you can get, especially if you're a composer using a computer program, where you've got great pages of empty stave looking at you, and you think, oh, I want to fill that up, really. This never bothered Duke Ellington. So you've got to get used to the fact that it's all right that just 2 things are playing for 60 bars and things like that, and not to write too orderly an ending on a lot of things. Billy Strayhorn would through compose, but it's also important to note that an important part of Ellington's compositional process is he would write a piece in sections, and then the final part of the process would be on the factory floor with the band rehearsing it And so he'd play it through. He said, no, okay, we're going to start at letter D now. It's a piece of music, for those of you who don't know, is in chunks, and they put letters on it so that you can rehearse them easily, A, B, C, D, and so on. And so so Ellington would say, we'll start the bit that starts at letter D, then I want to jump to letter N, we'll play that twice, and then we'll play the last 4 bars of letter B, and then we'll play a 12-bar blues in A flat. Let's see how that goes together. And so he would actually get his, a bit like putting together an IKEA sideboard, he'd get all his elements and actually try it in real time with his orchestra. We don't have that luxury, but what we do have that Ellington didn't have, of course, is computers to audition our compositions on for us. So you have to write the first thing that comes into your head, and then you have to not develop it too much. You wouldn't develop it, meticulously, like you could sit around and do and agonize over it. One of the things about Ellington's music, one of the reasons it sounds so direct is it's Ellington shooting from the hip all the time.
Now, there's also other aspects, because obviously you're demonstrating now that your knowledge of the Ellington Orchestra, how it was all created, how it was all put together, how they all worked, is unusually strong and deep. But he, of course, was trying to do something even beyond that, wasn't he, Ellington? Because if we look at the situation of jazz at that time, we look at America at the time, jazz music and the strength and the power of the jazz musicians was undermined by the racism, wasn't it, in America at that time? And I'm sure I'm right in saying that Duke Ellington wanted to raise jazz to the same level of appreciation that classical music had, didn't he?
That's a very interesting question. Ellington's career was very long, and so the racial overtones of it changed dramatically as he progressed, because the Ellington of the 60s, which is where the Planets is steeped, where we were getting into Malcolm X and all that sort of business, and the Kennedy shooting, that zeitgeist in America was very different to the zeitgeist in Harlem in the late 20s and 30s, when Ellington was playing in shows called things like the Chocolate Dandies of 1931 in the Cotton Club, where all those amazing orchestral sounds were developed in order to give rich white folk who would come uptown on a Saturday night to the Cotton Club a very stylized, savage version of Negro life. And Ellington was a big part of creating that, which he did partly because he needed the work, but partly one of the wonderful things about Duke Ellington is through all of this, he himself remained supremely elegant, articulate, and intelligent through it. So Ellington playing jungle music on one end, and it was jungle music, and you'd have Josephine Baker dancing in a skirt made out of just bananas. That's quite there's always kind of black art being forged under the outward carapace that it's minstrelry for rich white folk, but of course it wasn't. It had a whole other side to it as well. It's proper card carrying art, but it was serving both goals simultaneously in the 30s. In the 40s, Ellington started to become an advocate for the history of the American Negro in his work Black, Brown and Beige, Carnegie Hall, 1943, where he presented a symphonic length piece musically portraying the history of black people in America, going from the slaves up to the new world that they were all seeing was going to come after the Second World War. They thought there was going to be a sort of land of milk and honey after the Second World War, after the defeat of fascism, and indeed they were wrong. But there was a lot of optimism about that there. And so Ellington was always very, very clever in that. As regards his symphonic ambitions, this may, I don't know, you'd really have to ask him, but this may or may not have roots in the fact that his manager, Irving Mills, who was a white guy, who got Ellington into the spheres of influence he got into in the early 30s. It's worth remembering that Ellington's best commercial year was 1933. That's when he was actually at the financial apex of his entire existence.
Really? Gosh.
Yeah. And that's when Mills, or around that time, Mills decided to not only market him as another black dance band leader, but he'd started to market him as a composer. So a lot of it was spin. And this took on a more serious dimension when Ellington visited England in 1933, and Mills's PR had arrived before him, and the English, not knowing much about this and not having the same racial prejudices as the Americans, took Ellington at face value and cried him up as a huge composer. And so when he played the Palladium, he was taken out for dinner afterwards by Sir Thomas Beecham and compared in the press to Delius, who he confessed he'd never heard of. But it planted in Ellington's mind a seed that he could actually be taken seriously as a composer. I don't know whether as a classical composer, but as a composer of music. And so by the time you get to Black, Brown and Beige in the mid-40s, we see Duke Ellington. A lot of experimentation was going on in jazz in the mid-40s because it had been dance band music, whoever was playing it. Benny Goodman played Carnegie Hall in 1938 and kind of started to elevate it as a concert form. Ellington played Carnegie Hall in 1943, as I said. And jazz was also diverging harmonically and rhythmically. Bebop was starting up. The modern jazz had started in the mid-30s with Lester Young, Charlie Christian, Lionel Hampton, and those guys. And so by the early 40s, the burblings of bebop were starting. If you knew where to go in New York, you could go and hear Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie or Thelonious Monk. You could hear this kind of proto stuff. So that was all bubbling away. And Ellington was stretching his music in a different way. Ellington was really playing with form. So Ellington, rather than veering markedly from his already very sophisticated harmonic language, actually started saying, well, what's jazz for? And so he wrote Black, Brown, Beige. It's symphonic length. It's 45 minutes long, I believe. It's a proper great big thing. And this hadn't been done before. And a lot of things Ellington did after that are to do with the form of jazz and how it locks together, how it stretches and what it does. So I think in terms of mid-40s modernisation of the music, Ellington's contribution was form. His band did get quite beboppy in through the 50s, but that's because of the guys he hired. Yes. So I always like to think if Ellington needed bebop, he'd hire it in, rather than originate it himself. And then, of course, he mustn't forget the colossal impact of his collaboration with Billy Strayhorn, who is a young kid from Philadelphia, who came to audition for Ellington and so blew him away with his musicianship that Ellington just gave him a job as orchestrator, moved him into his brownstone house in Harlem in the late 30s. And Strayhorn, of course, was a big learned, classically trained composer, as well as a great jazz piano player. And so Strayhorn brought the whole kind of infusion of Stravinsky and Ravel into Ellington's band. If you listen to Ellington's music before and after about 1939, you can hear the impact Strayhorn had on him. Yep. Not only in contributing Strayhorn compositions, but also in changing Ellington's writings. There's certain colours in the reeds that don't happen before Strayhorn joined. Whether Ellington or Strayhorn wrote the piece, obviously Ellington was learning a lot from him, and Strayhorn was learning a lot from Ellington. Again, more symbiosis. Very interesting thing.
And when did Ellington take those classical composers, Grieg, for the Peer Gynt, and that which he then orchestrated in his own way?
Well, that was much later. That was 1959, I think, 58, 59. The record was released in 1960, and I have read that part of the reason for this was that obviously, we're into the post-Elvis era, and popular music had changed, and so Duke Ellington needed to find a new audience, and he thought, or somebody thought, I don't know whether it was him or his record company, thought a good idea would be to swing some of the classics to widen the appeal of it. I mean, I found myself when I mashed up Holst with Ellington that actually people love a bit of that. I think the thing about it is it's a good gag that everybody likes. if you listen to the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy with the baritone and tenor sax playing it over African drums, your first reaction is to laugh, and then you go, actually, yeah, it's funny, but that's brilliant as well. It's such a brilliant way they've done it. But it is kind of light-hearted. It's the light-hearted end of the jazz fusion arena.
But of course, now you performed your extraordinary and exceptional version of Holst the Planets. We had the privilege of hearing it in Deal last year, and I am a lover of Holst's original, and I feel on a high when I'm listening to it. I don't feel there's anything. I mean, it's uplifting and it's joyous and all of those things, but there's nothing humorous about it in any wrong way. It's witty. Yes, but there's nothing that's contrived to take to make amusement out of it. So, what is it that you are trying to say when you're taking? Obviously, you're modelling it on Duke Ellington, and you're steeped in this great love of this history and this love of this music and how it came about. But what is it you're trying to say? What are you trying to draw us into when you're creating this new world and this new dimension?
Oh, that's a very funny question. Well, it is just a gag, isn't it? I mean, that The Planets by Holst is one of the best things you'll ever hear, you know. And so the reason for doing it, the actual reason for doing it is that I was driving along listening to The Planets, and I was listening to Venus, and it struck me that the melody, one of the main melodies in Venus sounded very much like a Strayhorn composition. And then it occurred to me that I was also thinking at the time of wanting to present the Ellington Classical Concert, the Peer Gynt and the Nutcracker. Yeah. And the problem with that is that it's too short. There's not enough music to make a concert. And so I thought, well, I could do a few of these and that would make the rest of the concert. And I like trying to write in the style of Ellington. It's good. It's a good test of your ability to think with another hat on, because a lot of technical things that Ellington does, a lot of other arrangers don't do so much. I could get technical, but it's not that sort of a program, is it? So he's just got some tricks, and it was fun to apply that. And then make some decent music out of it, and hopefully make people like music. I mean, I think in Britain at the moment, music's in a pretty sad and sorry state in popular culture, and I think the more ways we can attract people to come and listen to some being played by humans to other humans, is anything is good.
Yes. You know? Well, it's definitely challenged at the moment. Now, that challenge, of course, has represented itself in this year. So we were going to hear Swan Lake coming to life in Deal in July. And I think your plan was you were going to take it on a mini tour and you were going to record it. And of course, that's all changed. So the piece is in existence already. But you've been able to, even in these lockdown days, you've been able to recreate a couple of the movements, which you're very kindly allowing us to share to our dear audience. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how you went about doing that? Because you obviously can't bring a whole big band into your living room, although it sounds as if you did.
No, but we have modern technology, you see. So it's possible now for one person to sit and I'll start again. Modern technology is freely available and not too dear. So it's now possible, if you've got a reasonably powerful computer, to have a recording setup that is more capable than the one they would have had at Abbey Road maybe 15 years ago. You can have that in your upstairs bedroom, which is what most of us now have, because you can buy a set of software, cost a couple of £100 and you're off, and a microphone. And with the internet, you don't have to deliver anything. There's no tape, there's no porterage, there's nothing. So I've got a mate who's very good with the studio. He plays trombone. And so in order to be able to present some facsimile of the Swan Lake material for this channel here, I recorded all the 6 reed parts myself, one after the other. And then it went over to Chris, and he put the 3 trombone parts on. And then we sent it off to a young trumpet player called Jim, who put the 4 trumpets on. And then on the other piece where there's some very high trumpet, there's only one person in Europe who can play up there, and that's Louis Dowswell. But he also is equipped with a computer and a microphone, and so we were able to email it to him, and he was able to record his part, and then it all went back to Chris, and it got mixed up in the usual sort of way. And of course, with modern technology, just to make it quick and easy, Chris also played all the rhythm instruments on his synthesizer, though it doesn't sound like it's, tubular bells. It isn't.
No, it isn't. And I'm just thinking, that's quite an interesting thought, isn't it? Because you just said that Louis Dowswell, and we know he is the only trumpet player who can play as powerfully in that stratospheric height, even beyond Cat Anderson and what he could do, really, and with an even greater power and greater surety. He's the only one in Europe, and this has gone to his home, and he's recorded it in his own private little room studio.
Yes, it took him longer than it took him longer than he would have liked, because his neighbours were having a barbecue and he was worried about upsetting them.
Okay, well, now you work regularly with the Ronnie Scott's Jazz Orchestra, and we were just talking just before we started doing this, and I said, the Ronnie Scott's Jazz Orchestra is arguably Europe's finest orchestra, and is a match for Wynton Marsalis's own Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. And he said, no, they are just supreme. And I said, no, hang on a minute, you're supreme as well, but there is a difference, isn't there? And you were going to tell us about those differences.
Oh, what, the $1 million a week funding?
Yes.
that's kind of a difference. I mean, we are lucky in Britain because, and make no mistake, because of free music education that they've now stopped, but because of free music education, the standard of professional musicianship in Britain of people my age is astonishingly high. I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about my colleagues. It's astonishingly high because it was made available to anybody who could play education, and as a concomitant result of that, the uptake was immense, and so the best players are phenomenal. We are able in Britain to be able to read and play with a bare minimum of rehearsal, which is why a lot of film music is recorded here, because although our musicians aren't the cheapest in the world, we get the job done the quickest because we do need the least rehearsal. So because of that, the Ronnie's band, we never get to practice.
Yes.
I did attend a rehearsal at the Lincoln Center by Wynton's band, and it was, I mean, they are amazing. Those musicians
are supreme, aren't they?
Yeah. They are, they're the Olympic team. They're amazing, and but they're amazing with a rehearsal budget that's just astonishing. I remember I watched them for an hour and a half rehearse the introduction to a vocal number, with Wynton directing it beautifully, going into microscopic detail about the balance of each clarinet in the section before the vocalist came in. It was phenomenal. And they had somebody there recording the rehearsal. They had two tea ladies. They're probably not called tea ladies in America, but they were, operatives with cake and coffee and so forth, making sure everybody was fed and watered during the rehearsal. There was a secretary and there was a copyist. So if anything on the parts had to be altered, it was altered there and then and reprinted and put out again. It's just fabulous. I mean,
well, that's lovely.
If we could have a crack on that budget, we'd be able to burn the moon.
Yes. Well, I actually think that is as it should be, because that's actually respecting musicians in the supreme level of talent that they have. But it's a vitally important thing that you say about music education, because if we don't remember that if you don't provide that music education and that whole journey starting early on, you're not going to get the results later on in life. So
no, nor is music going to occupy a terribly central part in culture.
No, no.
I remember once me and a friend of mine decided to see if we could make jazz popular by papering a jazz club. In this case, the what's it called? They have kind of a theatre in the Hippodrome Casino in London. It's a nice venue. And so we papered that with 20-somethings. I started with my nieces and I got them to invite all their friends. So we had a room full of kids in their 20s. And we put a band up in front of them playing a kind of jazz it's very nearly like rock and roll, but it was still jazz, you know, and quite leery. And I remember chatting to some of the lads who come to watch it at the bar. I was saying, "You enjoying it?" I said, "Oh, we love it." I said, "Do you listen to a lot of jazz?" And these weren't, you know, these are nice, educated young men with jobs in the city. You know, they were nice guys. And they said, "Well, this is the first time we've seen people with instruments." I said, "Well, what about at school?" And they went, "No, that didn't happen at school."
No. Well, we need to change that. Now, Pete,
It
I've
needs
just
to
got
change, yes.
I've got an eye on the time, and I do recollect that this particular software that we're using is going to come to a crashing halt in perhaps about 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay.
And so you're going to introduce us to 2 movements from your Swan Lake suite. And would you like to do that for us?
Sure. There are 9 movements in the Swan Lake suite, as I've done it. There are 6 in Tchaikovsky's, but he would put so many tunes into one movement that in terms of jazz, you need to give the tunes a bit more room to breathe so that you can have some solos and things like that. But Ellington, when he did the Nutcracker, would give them kind of jazzy sort of titles, the Nutcracker. So you get things like Sugar Rum Cherry and the Volga Vouty, and, you know, the Dance of the Little Reed Pipes became Toot Toot Tooty Toot and this sort of thing. So I have taken similar liberties with the titles. So the main theme, that thing, that's now called Swans of Paradise. And I've used as my rubric the voicings and the structure of Ellington's 1945 orchestration of Black and Tan Fantasy, one of his big main themes.
Yep.
And for the waltz, we had to first add a beat into every bar, because the waltz wasn't really on Ellington's language in the 60s.
No.
So in the case of the Nutcracker, the waltz of the Little Flowers goes into 4, so it needed to become something in 4, and so it's become the Sugar Hill 4-step, because it's called a waltz by Tchaikovsky, so now it's a 4-step, and Sugar Hill was the posh bit of Harlem that Ellington alludes to in a lot of his writing, so it seems to be appropriate to call it that. And you'll hear solos from me on clarinet and baritone sax. Chris plays all the trombones. Jim plays the plunger trumpet, and Louis plays the high note trumpet over the 2 pieces. And it was all done in bedrooms and living rooms within the M25.
Well, I knew it was going to be immense fun talking with you, Pete. A total pleasure as always, because you just imbue light and fun into everything that you do. And we will look forward to immensely welcoming you and the phenomenal band of Ronnie Scott's Jazz Orchestra back to Deal at the earliest opportunity we can, and making sure that as many people can enjoy you performing live, so that they can get that extraordinary buzz that you're talking about.
Oh yeah, it'd be great, wouldn't it? I mean, I think it'll be a long time before we see a big band, because out of all the things that contravenes social distancing, a big band that needs to sit in close proximity and then breathe deeply from its lungs in public. It's the back of the COVID-19 grid, isn't it? A big band in an enclosed place.
It certainly doesn't lend itself to the antithesis. It doesn't lend itself to social distancing. But
it really,
we will find the time, we will find the place, and we will.
It'll be back,
and it will be back, and we look forward to it immensely. Thank you so much, Pete. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.